Good morning, friends. I wanted to share with you something I came across, some laws that either once were or are still in effect in various places in the United States. I think you'll find this interesting. In Iowa, it was a law that one-armed piano players must perform for free. In Wyoming, you cannot take a picture of a rabbit during the month of June. If you keep your donkey in a bathtub in Georgia, you might be arrested. In Harper Woods, Michigan, it's illegal to paint a sparrow and then to sell it as a parakeet. In Wisconsin, there's a law that says you cannot serve apple pie in public without cheese. It's illegal to whistle underwater in Vermont. Begs the question, did somebody drown because there was an underwater whistling contest? In Tulsa, Oklahoma, you need a licensed engineer to open a bottle of soda. It's illegal for a man to knit during fishing season in New Jersey. In Hood River, Oregon, you need a license to juggle. In Connecticut, a pickle must bounce to be considered a pickle. Has somebody been watching too much VeggieTales? A bouncing pickle? And after you try to bounce it, do you want to eat it? Well, of course, these laws are silly, aren't they? And I'm sure the stories behind them are equally ridiculous. Silly rules are nothing new, though. When rules and laws take priority over the people they're meant to benefit, they can not just be silly, they can be seriously harming to the people they were designed or intended to benefit. Well, the gospel writer Luke describes a couple of run-ins Jesus had with a group of powerful lawmakers and rules keepers of his day. They seem to have lost touch with their calling to love, to serve, and to care for human beings. It just so happens that both incidents occurred on the Sabbath. And why is that important? Well, it goes all the way back to the fourth of God's original 10 commandments. In Exodus 20, verse 8 reads, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Well, like all of God's commands, the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a blessing to us. It's God's grace. It's not a set of rules to burden us, but a gift to be received. The psalmist writes, "Your compassion, Lord, is great. Preserve my life according to your laws." All well and good, except the people who first received these laws must have been kind of Baptist-y at heart, because the first thing they did was form a committee to study the commandments. And it seems they wanted to nail down every contingency and to cover every base. They asked, what if this happens on the Sabbath? Or what if that happens on the Sabbath? And over a period of many years, a kind of bylaws and constitution was developed with hundreds of rules and regulations for what could and could not be done, and when and how on the Sabbath, as well as other days. By the time Jesus arrived, groups like the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had succeeded in turning the Sabbath day into a burden instead of the blessing that God intended it to be. But Luke shows us these two encounters between Jesus and the Pharisees in his chapter 6 that expose just how silly and how sad these religious fanatics had become. The first incident happens in chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, and it involved Jesus' disciples passing through a wheat field, and they're picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating them on the Sabbath. The law provided that grain could be collected from a stranger's field as long as a sickle wasn't used. So the disciples' violation is not about taking the grain, but with the fact that they rubbed their hands together. They were guilty of harvesting and threshing to satisfy their need on the Sabbath. Well, the delegation of Pharisees that were keeping an eye out close by were shocked and horrified. They believed not breaking the law is the same as being a good moral person. And the Lord answers by reminding them of an incident in the life of David that illustrates that the law of the Sabbath was never intended to take priority over human need. 1 Samuel 21 tells the story of when David and his men were fleeing from Saul, and they were tired and hungry, and they ate the sacred bread. Their need had been more important than ceremonial regulations. And Jesus was appealing to the same principle. Human need is more important than human regulations and rules. By comparing himself and his disciples with David and his men, Jesus was saying, if you condemn me, you got to condemn David. Well, the religious authorities were shocked and horrified at Jesus' stinging criticism. I mean, here was the most powerful teacher anyone had ever seen, and he was turning the tables on them. He was attacking their religion. He was attacking what they would likely say was the very best part of them, that they kept the law. He wasn't condemning prostitutes or the tax collectors or the riffraff of society. Just the opposite. He seemed to be drawn to those kinds of people, and he treated them with respect and kindness and granted them dignity. But he treated the religious nobility with disdain and sarcasm. He not only pushed back against them, but he called into question the very foundation of the religious system, their own false spirituality. Well, what can we learn from this? Anyone who tries to achieve salvation, to justify their standing with God by works, ends up becoming a legalist. And one of the signs of legalism is a critical spirit. Anyone who tries to base their core identity on what they do, or the color of their skin, or their politics, or anything other than who God is and their relationship with God, quickly becomes judgmental. That's a danger for any of us. Legalists, you see, find it so very easy to ignore God's love and grace. Legalists apply one standard to others and another to themselves. I heard a story about some missionaries overseas, and they had a craving for peanut butter, but where they were stationed, they couldn't get any. So they decided to write some friends back in the States. They asked them to send a jar of peanut butter. Well, these friends wanted to help out, so they not only sent a jar, they sent a box with many jars of peanut butter. I hope it was Jif, the one true peanut butter, but I don't know. Anyway, there were some other missionaries in that same area who thought it was unspiritual to crave peanut butter. I mean, they said it was, if a person becomes a missionary, they should leave the luxuries of the United States behind, and they should take up their cross and not desire peanut butter. I guess they probably thought that by wanting peanut butter, they were acting like Lot's wife, who looked over her shoulder longingly at Sodom and Gomorrah and all she had left behind. Well, eventually it got so bad that these missionaries left the mission field and went back to the United States. I wonder how many missionaries give up being missionaries because of the self-righteous, judgmental, legalistic attitudes of fellow missionaries. How many people leave churches? How many people never come inside a church? How many get the wrong idea about Christ and Christianity because of the legalistic, self-righteous, judgmental attitude of a few so-called Christians? I'm reminded of something Francis Schaeffer once said. The single greatest obstacle to faith in the world is not atheism. It is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, but who deny Jesus with their lives. Well, back to Jesus and his answer. In verse 5, Jesus uses his favorite term to identify himself. And it's from Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man. He says the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Like David and his men, Christ and his disciples were hungry, and the Pharisees would rather see them starve than pick wheat on the Sabbath. But the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. He's the master. He's the supreme authority over the Sabbath. He gave the law in the first place, and no one was better qualified than he to interpret its spiritual meaning and to save it from misunderstanding and misappropriation, as these so-called teachers of the law had done. Jesus is claiming that even this most sacred observance of the Sabbath rest comes under his lordship, his authority. Every square inch in creation is his. Jesus Christ is indeed Lord of all of life. Well, let's take a look at the second Sabbath incident, beginning with verse 6. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. Well, Jesus had gone to the synagogue on the Sabbath to worship as usual, and as happened a lot, he was chosen as the visiting teacher for the day. Verse 7 says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. You see, they just knew Jesus would be drawn to the one person in the whole room who was hurting the most. And according to their precious tradition, no healing could be done on the Sabbath. You see, healing was practicing medicine, and a person could not practice his or her profession on the Sabbath. The religious authorities were more concerned about protecting their laws than with freeing a person from painful suffering. Jesus was more concerned, on the other hand, with doing good and helping those in need. Angry and embarrassed by their earlier defeat, these law experts and Pharisees were now eager to trap Jesus. They were determined to build a case against him. Verse 8 says, but Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, get up and stand in front of everyone. So he got up and stood there. I wonder, is Luke telling us that Jesus is all-knowing, that he's omniscient? I don't think so. Because you see, Jesus is truly God and truly man, but as the man, he chose to limit his power. I think it's more, he just knew human nature. He was an expert in people. And so he knew these people were bent toward evil. He called the man to the center stage. He worked out in the open for all to see, and the suspense builds when the man steps up in front of them. Verse 9 says, then Jesus said to them, I ask you, which is lawful for the Sabbath, on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it? You see, Jesus' question elevates the issue beyond or above theological debate. You see, if they answered correctly, they'd have to say it was right to do good on the Sabbath and wrong to do harm. Their very own rabbinic tradition in the Mishnah said, quote, choose the way that preserves life. If it was right to do good, then Jesus was doing good by healing this man. You see, there's deer season, and there's turkey season, and there's tax season, but doing good is always in season. Verse 10, he looked around at them and then said to the man, stretch out your hand. He did so, and his hand was completely restored. Interesting, only Dr. Luke mentions in verse 6 the detail that it was the man's right hand that had atrophied. And also consistent with Luke, what happens next is a most unmiraculous miracle. No incantations, no hocus pocus, just the simple command to stretch out his atrophied, useless, pain-racked hand. And with his word went his power. Isn't that amazing. The man's hand was restored completely. But as they say, no good deed goes unpunished, for Jesus had violated the ceremonial law. For Jesus, not doing good is worse than doing bad, because God is a God of compassion and of mercy and grace and love. And Jesus is demonstrating for all to see God's people are to have the same attitude of compassion and to do the same acts of love and service God has shown to them. But don't we often find ourselves thinking, if not acting, like those Pharisees? I heard of some men out golfing one day, a doctor, a priest, and an engineer, and they found themselves out on the course waiting behind an especially slow group of golfers. The engineer asked, "Well, what's with these guys? We've been waiting around for 15 minutes. The doctor agreed. He said, "I've never seen such slow golfers." So the pastor noted, "Well, here comes the groundskeeper. Let's ask him about this." And so they said, "Say, what's with this group of golfers ahead of us?" The groundskeeper said, "Oh, that's a group of blind firefighters. They lost their sight saving our clubhouse from a fire last year. So we always let them play for free anytime they want." Well, the group was silent for a moment. The pastor sympathized. He said, "Well, that's so sad. I think I'll say a special prayer tonight for them." The doctor added, "That's a good idea. In fact, I think I'll contact my ophthalmologist friend and see if she can do anything for these guys." Well, the engineer spoke up and he said, "Well, that's all great, but in the meantime, why can't these guys play at night?" Great compassion there, huh? The Pharisees had made a day of blessing into a day of bondage and burden. It takes a lot of skill and practice to do that. I think they had done that for a long time. That's the one thing they were really good at. Well, then verse 11. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Jesus had beaten them in argument. He had discredited them in full view of the public. He had humiliated them. How did they take it? Not so well, as you might guess. The Greek tells us that they were literally filled with senseless rage. They were out of their minds with anger. Troublesome critics transformed into full-blown enemies and began plotting how they might get him. Isn't it ironic that on this day of all days, the Sabbath day, the Pharisees began to scheme and to plan to take Jesus' life? A few minutes earlier, they were outraged that Jesus was giving life on that same Sabbath. Let me offer four principles of application for our everyday lives. First of all, living out our faith in the world should benefit, should bless others, not harm them. Now, that doesn't mean we will always affirm others or never disagree with others. We may have to confront a person with the truth of their own sin, their own condition, apart from God. But what that means is we will always seek to work for God's best for them. Secondly, living out our faith in the world is under the lordship of Jesus. Let me ask you, are we learning as followers of Christ that the Lord of the Sabbath is also the Lord of every area of our lives? There is no area of our lives, no aspect of who we are beyond or outside the lordship of Christ. So following Jesus is then not just a matter of the religious things we do, and certainly on just specific days like Sunday. It's about Him living and loving in and through us every day of our lives. Number 3, living out our faith in the world should produce good in our lives. Christians, we're not required to keep the Sabbath laws, but we are to observe the Sabbath principle. Hebrews 4, 9, and 10 says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from His." That's another way of saying Christ is our Sabbath. He is our rest. And finally, living out our faith in the world should produce blessings, not burdens for others. You see, we're blessed to bless. We're given to give. We're loved to love. 1 John 4:19 says, "We love because He first loved us." Years ago, there was a crisis in Holland. And in that time and place, many Christians believed that Sunday was like the Sabbath, and that no one was to do any work or play, only worship and rest. And much of Holland is below sea level, but the Dutch reclaimed the land by constructing an ingenious system of dikes and canals to hold back the seawater. But one Sunday, the storms raised the water level to a dangerous height, and water threatened to overflow the dikes and flood a particular city, threatening life and ruining the crops. Many residents went to the dikes and added sandbags, but there were far too few workers to make a difference. So the local constable went to a nearby church, and he appealed to the members to come and help. Well, the leaders quickly met, but they decided it would be sinful to break the Sabbath rules to work on Sunday. But the pastor appealed to the leaders to change their minds, and he referred them to this very passage in Luke, where Jesus broke the Sabbath rules of His day for the benefit, for the good of others. The reply of the chief church leader is classic. He said, quote, "I've always had a hard time myself accepting what Jesus did on the Sabbath." It would be funny if it were not so tragic. For the town flooded, and most of the crops were ruined. But many of the Christians felt pious because they hadn't desecrated the Sabbath day. The thing is, the gospel, the good news of God's love in Jesus Christ, offers a far better, far more beautiful story. For God loved people He created in His image so much. And when He saw the threat of the flood of sin and evil and death, He came Himself in the person of His Son Jesus. He lived the life we should have lived, but He died the death we should have died. On the cross, He became that dike, and He absorbed the flood of God's wrath against sin and evil and death. Not God's arbitrary anger like humans. God's wrath is His settled opposition to that which harms His precious creatures made in His image. And so when we see what He did for us, and we allow Him to embrace us into His life and love, He floods our hearts with His very divine presence and power, His Holy Spirit. And then we can now go and show and share His love with others. I ask, if you feel today your heart strangely open to this good news for the very first time, will you ask Him to embrace you and to enfold you into His life and love? Will you make the decision to follow Jesus today and to allow Him to change you and allow Him to bring you into and to join Him on His ongoing mission to help others find Him and follow Him? And if that's your decision today, would you reach out to us? Email me, or contact a Christian friend that you know, or a pastor in your area, and talk with them about this decision. Ask them to pray with you, to help you know first steps to make in following Jesus. Do that today, will you? God bless you.
God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power, crown thine ancient church's story, bring her bud to glorious flower, grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, for the facing of this hour. Lo, the hosts of evil round us, scorned by Christ, assail his way.